I moved to Millstone Lake for peace. After retiring from the military, all I wanted was to enjoy quiet mornings fishing from my dock and evenings sipping coffee on my porch. My property sat on the far end of the lake, surrounded by woods and thick silence. When I bought the land, the dock was in bad shape, so I tore it down and built a new one from scratch, planks of pressure-treated pine, anchored with steel posts I drove in myself. It was my pride, my escape, my sanctuary. Then the HOA came knocking. Technically, my property wasn't part of the Millstone Lake Homeowners Association. My parcel was grandfathered in before the HOA was established, but that didn't stop them from trying to bring me into compliance. The first notice came in the mail, an official-looking letter claiming I had illegally modified the shoreline and was violating communal space regulations. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, a man in a polo shirt and khakis showed up at my gate. His name was Leonard Brinks, the HOA president. He wore a name tag and sunglasses like he was someone important. "You're not permitted to have a private dock," he said, peering past me toward the water. "It's on my land," I replied calmly. "Built it myself. Paid for the permits." Leonard clicked his tongue. "We have rules. Shared lake, shared shore. You can't exclude the community." "That's funny," I said, "because I distinctly remember buying this land. Nobody shared the price with me." Leonard huffed and handed me another copy of the violation letter. "This is your last warning. Take it down or we will—" I laughed in his face and shut the gate. 2 days later, I came home from a supply run to find my dock in ruins, snapped boards floating in the shallows, steel posts sawed clean off at the base. They even posted no fishing signs along my property line. I stared at the destruction, heart pounding. Rage burned in my chest, not just at the damage, but at the audacity. They had trespassed, vandalized, dared to tell me I couldn't fish on my own damn land. I took pictures, called the sheriff. Deputy Carver showed up an hour later, took one look inside. "HOA again?" "Yeah. This time they destroyed private property." He scratched his head. "You got cameras?" "Nope. Didn't think I needed any this far out." He scribbled notes. "Well, I'll file the report, but without proof, not much we can do. It'll come down to your word against theirs." I clenched my jaw but nodded. "Then I'll handle it myself." He looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means they messed with the wrong guy." I spent the next 2 days planning. No hot-headed retaliation. No shouting matches. Just quiet, meticulous strategy. The kind of planning I used to do overseas. Only now, my mission was legal, targeted, and very personal. First, I reviewed my deed and survey maps. My land extended 40 feet past the tree line along the lake. The dock? Fully on my property. I even found the permits I'd pulled from the county office. Everything was legal. Next, I took a walk along the HOA shoreline, camera in hand. I documented every one of their communal structures, benches, picnic tables, their boat launch, even the small floating dock they used for events. I traced power lines, water lines, and fencing, photographing where their amenities crossed over the land they didn't technically own. The next day, I paid a visit to the county zoning office. "Hi," I said to the clerk. "I need to file a shoreline dispute and a property encroachment complaint." "Against who?" "Millstone Lake HOA." Her eyebrows shot up. 30 minutes later, I had filed 2 formal complaints. One for unlawful trespassing and destruction of property, and another for illegal use of shoreline infrastructure on privately owned land. But that wasn't enough. I wanted leverage, so I dug deeper into public records, HOA meeting minutes, community plans. Turns out, the HOA didn't have clear rights to most of the shoreline they used. The original developer had failed to transfer proper easements, and no one had corrected it. The dock, the boat ramp, even the walking trail, they were all sitting on land they assumed was theirs. But by law, it was still owned by an old trust the HOA never paid to acquire. And that trust had expired, which meant no legal claim. They were squatting. I hired a real estate attorney the next day. "This is strong," he said, going over the documents. "You could file an injunction today and shut down half their amenities." "I don't want half," I replied. "I want all of it." 1 week later, I had cameras installed, motion sensors on the shoreline, and private property, no trespassing signs every 10 feet. I posted a cease and desist to the HOA, demanding they stop using any access points bordering my land. Then I waited. Sure enough, Leonard showed up again, this time fuming. "You think you can block community access?" "No," I said. "The law does." He sneered. "We'll see about that." "You already have," I said, handing him a copy of the injunction. "Served this morning. That dock of yours? The boat launch? The trails? All shut down until further ruling." He stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. "You can't do this." "I didn't. The county did." He stormed off without another word. I stood there, heart steady, watching him walk. This was only the beginning. They came for my dock. Now, I was coming for their entire shoreline. The cease and desist hit harder than I expected. Within 24 hours, the HOA's private Facebook page, which someone kindly leaked screenshots of, was in full meltdown mode. Residents were furious. No more boat launches, no more lakeside yoga classes, no more summer kids camps on the floating dock. Leonard tried to calm the mob with a post full of legalese and half-truths, claiming the closure was temporary and under review. But I knew better. Their whole setup was built on assumptions and poor paperwork. And now, that paper wall was crumbling. I spent the next morning with my attorney, Mr. Rayburn, a sharp, soft-spoken man with a reputation for precision. He was impressed by how thoroughly I had documented the HOA's encroachments. We drafted a formal complaint to the county's Department of Environmental Management and another to the Planning Commission. "You're not just shutting them down," Rayburn said, tapping a finger on the stack of files. "You're exposing years of negligence. They're going to panic." "Good," I replied. "Let them." That same afternoon, I received a visit from someone new, a woman in a tailored navy blue suit, clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Ms. Garland, the HOA's in-house counsel. "I'd like to discuss a resolution," she said, eyes scanning my posted signage. "Funny," I said. Leonard didn't seem so open to resolution when his crew took a saw to my dock. She gave a tight smile. "That was unfortunate and unauthorized. The HOA would like to offer to rebuild it." I folded my arms. "Under what condition?" "In exchange for dropping the injunction and allowing community access to resume, under supervision, of course." "Let me get this straight," I said. "They destroy my property, illegally post no fishing signs, trespass on my land, and now they want me to let them back in like nothing happened?" She shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "There's a lot of tension right now. We think it's in everyone's interest to de-escalate." I leaned in. "There's no deal. You don't own the shoreline. You never did. You just bullied people into thinking you did." Garland opened her mouth, then closed it. "This isn't a negotiation," I said firmly. "It's a reckoning." She left without another word. By the end of the week, the HOA had to cancel their lakefront movie night. The residents were furious. With the dock sealed off, they had no safe place to launch kayaks. One man tried to fish from a side embankment and got tangled in the brush. Word started to spread that their community access had never been legally theirs to begin with. Meanwhile, I went on the offensive. I met with the county's environmental inspector, showed him photos of the HOA's erosion-prone boat ramp and the trash bins sitting 5 feet from the waterline violations of state conservation laws. He promised a formal inspection. Then came the Planning Commission meeting. I showed up early in a clean shirt with 3 folders and a thumb drive full of evidence. When my name was called, I stepped up to the podium and laid it all out. The HOA never secured easements. They built permanent structures on land they didn't own. They caused environmental damage to the shoreline. And they retaliated against a legal property owner by destroying his private dock. By the time I was done, the commission chair had raised both eyebrows. "This is serious," she said. "We'll need to investigate thoroughly." Leonard, sitting 4 rows back, looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon. A week later, the fallout began. First, the county slapped the HOA with a stop-use order for the boat ramp and shoreline path. Environmental violations were pending. Fines could reach tens of thousands. Then, the insurance provider for the HOA opened an investigation into the dock destruction incident, since it could be classified as deliberate property damage. That meant Leonard and the board members were now personally liable, and they knew it. Suddenly, Leonard wasn't so smug. He sent a handwritten note to my mailbox. Mr. Callahan, we regret the events that have transpired and would like to meet personally to resolve matters in a mutually beneficial way. Please consider a discussion over coffee or lunch. Sincerely, Leonard Brinks*. I didn't respond. Instead, I gave the letter to my attorney, who laughed and filed it with the rest. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't after money. I wasn't after revenge. I wanted to set a precedent. Too many of these HOAs operate like little kingdoms, run by people who enjoy control more than community. They assume everyone will just roll over when pushed. Not me. I'd spent years in places where real power was subtle, strategic, quiet, and now I was applying it to Millstone Lake. With the shoreline access completely closed off, neighboring properties began to question their dues. Residents showed up at HOA meetings demanding answers. Some of them came to me privately asking how I'd done it. I showed them the same process, how to request deeds, challenge easements, and push back legally. It spread like wildfire. By the end of the month, 3 other homeowners had filed their own complaints. One claimed the walking trail looped too close to their well. Another claimed unauthorized landscaping encroached on their septic field. The HOA, overwhelmed, couldn't respond to it all at once. I heard Leonard was drinking heavier than usual. One morning, as I sat fishing for my rebuilt dock, quietly restored by a private crew I hired, I saw 2 county trucks roll into the HOA parking lot. Inspectors climbed out with clipboards and cameras. I smiled and cast my line. Peace was returning, but this time it was protected by law, by truth, and by one man who refused to be bullied. The cracks in the HOA's control didn't just start to show, they split wide open. It began with whispers, discontent, quiet conversations in driveways, messages exchanged in private neighborhood chats. At first, it was just a few homeowners, the types who always paid dues without question, who put little flags in their gardens and followed every suggested rule. But now, they were angry, really angry, because I wasn't the only one the HOA had messed with. Janice Mullins, a retired nurse, came to my gate one morning holding a binder. I thought it was just me, she said, but now I realize it's a pattern. I invited her in for coffee. Janice had lived in the HOA community for 11 years. She told me how Leonard fined her $200 for painting her shutters a shade off from approved beige, then $150 for having an unapproved flower arrangement on her porch. When she contested the charges, they suspended her pool access. I paid them, she said, staring at her mug, just to make them leave me alone. But now I want to fight back. We spent hours going over her documentation. Her violations were petty, often based on vague language in the community bylaws. But the fines? They were real and frequent. By the end of the week, I had 7 neighbors come forward with similar stories: unauthorized citations, unexplained fines, surveillance photos of their backyards taken without consent. One man even had a warning issued for non-regulation bird feeders. Bird feeders. The HOA wasn't managing a community. It was running a regime. So I helped them organize. I showed them how to request financial records from the HOA, something they were legally entitled to but had never dared ask for. When the board delayed, we filed a formal demand under state homeowner protection laws. 2 weeks later, the documents arrived, and they were explosive. The HOA had been collecting tens of thousands of dollars in fines and administrative fees, but a chunk of that money wasn't going toward maintenance or repairs. Instead, it had been funneled into a discretionary fund used for board expenses, meals, retreats, golf outings, even a catered holiday party that cost over $8,000. That was strike 1. Strike 2 came when we discovered that the HOA's insurance premiums had doubled in the past year, after a string of minor legal complaints from homeowners. And instead of addressing the complaints, Leonard and the board passed on the costs by raising dues. Strike 3, their financial auditor was a former board member's nephew. That night, the residents gathered in Janice's backyard. More than 30 people showed up, folding chairs in rows, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp and focused. These were parents, veterans, retirees, people who had followed rules their whole lives. But now they saw the truth. I stood before them and laid it out. You were told to stay quiet, to obey, to follow rules written in fine print and enforced without mercy. But now you've seen the receipts. Now you know. Murmurs ran through the crowd. This HOA operates like a private club, not a public service. But you are the real owners here. Your dues pay for everything. You have power. Use it. We voted that night to form a reform committee. Janice led it. I stayed on as legal strategist. 3 others volunteered to collect proxy votes for the upcoming board meeting. The goal? Trigger a recall vote and replace the entire board. The panic hit Leonard Circle fast. They sent out glossy flyers warning about misinformation campaigns and outsiders with personal vendettas. They tried to discredit me by calling me a disgruntled non-member with extremist views. Didn't work, because now people wanted to hear my story. I printed photos of my destroyed dock and laminated copies of the cease and desist. Residents stopped me in the grocery store just to shake my hand. At the next HOA meeting, we packed the room. More than 80 people showed up, many with copies of the budget reports we had circulated. Leonard tried to maintain control, but his voice trembled. Let's remember, this meeting is for board-approved agenda items. I move for a recall vote, Janice said, standing tall in the front row. That's not on the Agan. I second, someone else called out. A cheer went up. The board tried to adjourn the meeting. People shouted. One woman screamed about her missing community refund check. Another demanded to know why the HOA pool had mold on the chairs, but Leonard's personal driveway had been resurfaced using shared resources. They couldn't contain it. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Leonard's face went pale. Within 3 weeks, the new board was sworn in. Janice became interim president. The rest of the former board resigned before formal charges could be filed. Leonard quietly listed his house for sale. The new board took immediate action. First, they dropped all pending fines. Second, they refunded improper charges from the discretionary fund. Third, and most importantly, they passed a resolution recognizing the full property rights of non-HOA parcels, including shoreline access boundaries. My dock, officially protected. My land, untouchable. And the signs that once said no fishing, removed and replaced with private property, protected by county ordinance. But my fight wasn't just about a dock anymore. It was about principle, a message. You don't get to push people around and call it community. One morning, I stood at the edge of the lake, fishing rod in hand. The water was still, peaceful. 2 kids from down the road rode their bikes past the fence line and waved. Mr. Callahan, one called, "You gonna catch another monster bass?" Trying, I smiled. Behind me, the once patrolled HOA pavilion now stood quiet and used. Their boat launch still closed, pending safety inspections. The new board was taking things slow, careful, honest. And me? I finally had what I came for. Not just silence, but justice. And it all started because they broke the wrong man's dock. 3 weeks had passed since the old HOA board collapsed like a poorly stacked house of cards. The neighborhood was quieter, lighter, even hopeful. Residents waved at each other again, and conversations were about cookouts, not complaints. The reform committee, now officially recognized, was overseeing audits and reviewing contracts. For the first time in years, people felt like they had a voice. But not everyone was content with the new order. One afternoon, while I was reinforcing my shoreline fence, my phone buzzed. It was Janice, her voice tight and urgent. "You need to come to the community center. Now." When I arrived, the room was half lit. The projector was on, and Janice stood at the front of the room beside a large bulletin board covered in documents and photographs. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, balding, with a pinched expression and an armload of files. A few others from the reform committee sat nearby, their faces tight, with unease. "This is Mr. Teller," Janice said, motioning to the man. "He's an independent IT contractor." We asked him to audit the HOA's server. I nodded, stepping forward. Mr. Teller took a breath. I discovered a series of unauthorized access logs from someone who no longer holds an official board position. Leonard. I asked. Teller nodded. Even after his removal, he used a backdoor admin account to access internal records, emails, and, more concerning, he downloaded files related to property easements and private complaints. He's trying to build a case, I said flatly. Or worse. It got worse. Teller clicked to a folder labeled Callahan Private Docs. In it were screenshots of satellite images of my home, close-ups of my shoreline fence, zoomed-in shots of my truck's license plate, and photos of me fishing, all time-stamped after the injunction. He's stalking you, Janice said softly. And building a dossier, I murmured. We filed a report with the sheriff that evening. But I knew Leonard. Filing reports wasn't going to stop him. Not if he thought he had one last move to play. A few nights later, I was woken up at 2:14 a.m. My motion sensor lights flickered on. The camera pinged. I opened my phone. There, plain as daylight, was a figure in a hoodie crouched by my shoreline fence, snipping at the metal post, trying to remove the private property sign. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight and my jacket, and made it outside in seconds. Hey! I shouted, blinding him in the beam of light. The figure froze, then bolted, toward the woods, through the thicket near the old canoe racks. Too slow. As he ran, his hood fell back. Leonard. I didn't chase him. I didn't have to. The camera caught everything. His face, the cutters in his hand, the trespassing. I turned over the footage to Deputy Carver the next morning. Well, he said, watching the footage on the laptop, that's criminal trespassing, attempted vandalism, and violation of a standing injunction. He closed the screen and looked up at me. Want to press charges? Yes, I said. Every charge I'm legally allowed to press. Leonard was arrested 2 days later. The arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The new HOA board issued a public statement condemning Leonard's actions and urging the community to respect the rule of law and the rights of all property owners. But Leonard wasn't done. From jail, he made a call to a local blog, an HOA sympathizer site that thrived on drama and one-sided stories. He painted himself as a victim of a coordinated smear campaign by anti-community extremists. He claimed I had falsified documents, manipulated elderly homeowners, and orchestrated a hostile takeover. The blog ran the headline the next morning, "Veteran turned vigilante, the man who hijacked Millstone Lake, but this time it backfired." Because the community knew the truth now. They had seen the receipts. Dozens of people flooded the comment section with corrections, screenshots, photos, and their own stories of abuse under Leonard's board. The article was removed within 48 hours. Leonard's bail was denied on the grounds that he posed an ongoing threat to community safety and was under investigation for financial fraud tied to the HOA discretionary fund. Karma had finally shown up, and she wasn't subtle. With Leonard off the board and behind bars, things finally began to settle. The Reform Committee transitioned into a permanent HOA oversight body with term limits and mandatory audits. The Shoreline? It was remapped using the proper legal surveys, and everyone's property boundaries were officially filed with the county. I even got a visit from the county commissioner. "Wanted to thank you," she said, shaking my hand. "Millstone Lake's been a mess for years. You finally forced us to clean it up. I just wanted to fish in peace," I said with a chuckle. "Well, Mr. Callahan," she said, "you didn't just rebuild a dock. You rebuilt a community." I stood on my dock again that evening, the lake bathed in the glow of a crimson sunset. The kids were playing down the way. A couple was kayaking. The HOA signs were gone, replaced with modest wooden markers that simply read, "Private boundary. Respect your neighbor." It was quiet, just the way I liked it. The dock beneath my feet creaked slightly, the good kind of creak. The kind that reminded you it was real, solid, built by hand. The HOA tried to break me, tried to erase my rights, humiliate me, push me out. But I pushed back with patience, evidence, and relentless focus. And in the end, it wasn't just my shoreline they lost. It was their entire grip on power. With Leonard behind bars and the new board cleaning house, things around Millstone Lake felt lighter, like a storm had passed and left fresh air in its wake. But I knew better than to think it was over. Wounds like these had roots. And sure enough, while clearing out the HOA's old files, the Reform Committee unearthed something that had been quietly festering for years. It started with an old survey map. Janice called me one morning. "We found a deed packet at the bottom of a locked cabinet," she said. "It's dated 1976, and it references something called the Burkhart parcel." "Never heard of it," I said. "You wouldn't have. The HOA board didn't want anyone to." She scanned the file and emailed it to me. It included a faded blueprint and a legal description of a large wedge of land, about 10 acres, running along the southern curve of the lake. Not just a patch of forest or a trail. This land included a significant portion of the community's hiking paths, picnic pavilions, and part of their nature reserve. And here was the kicker: the deed had never been properly transferred to the HOA. That meant they'd been using that land for over 40 years without owning it. Technically, the land was still held under the now-defunct Burkhart Trust, a private family trust that had dissolved in the late 80s when its last living beneficiary passed away. In the absence of any legal transfer or sale, the land defaulted into county ownership by abandonment. Janice's voice was barely steady when she said it. "The county owns it now, and they don't even know it." I grinned. "Then it's time we make them aware." The next day, I drove with Janice and 2 other committee members to the county courthouse. We walked into the assessor's office with a copy of the map, the deed, and the case we'd built. The clerk looked it over with a frown. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. "This parcel's been sitting as a pending designation in our inactive files. No taxes collected. No active owner on file since 1989. So, what happens now?" I asked. She shrugged. "Technically, it's county land. But if no one contests it and you've identified a community use violation, this could be classified as open for lease or auction." Janice leaned forward. "Are you saying it can be bought?" The clerk nodded. "Under certain conditions, yes. Especially if it's being used without legal agreement. We filed an official request to trigger a land reassessment and notify the county zoning board. Within a week, the land was scheduled to be listed. But here's where it got even better. Because the HOA, under Leonard's leadership, had built a number of permanent improvements on that very land: benches, fences, stone trails, and even an equipment shed, structures they didn't have a legal right to place. Suddenly, they were at risk of losing everything south of the lake. The news exploded in the community. At a special meeting called by the Reform Committee, over 100 people packed into the old community hall. Janice stood at the front, next to a screen showing the county's auction notice. "The land in question is here," she said, circling the southern bank with a red laser pointer. "It includes approximately 1/4 of the amenities the HOA has used for years, including the hiking trail loop, the outdoor yoga platform, and the children's summer camp staging area." Murmurs filled the room. "Is there any way to stop it?" someone asked. Janice shook her head. "Not unless someone buys it and allows the HOA to lease it back." A silence settled over the room. Then someone stood up. A younger man, Aaron, I think his name was. He raised a hand and asked the question that changed everything. "What if we buy it?" A ripple ran through the crowd. Janice looked at me. I smiled. That night, we launched the Millstone Commons Trust, a legal collective fund formed by private property owners within the community. The plan was simple. Every homeowner could contribute whatever amount they chose. The goal was to raise enough to buy the parcel and manage it as a nonprofit, not under HOA control, but as shared land protected from misuse. Within 5 days, we had over $120,000 pledged. When the auction day arrived, only 2 bidders registered: the Millstone Commons Trust and one nervous man representing a shell company Leonard had secretly created before his arrest. We outbid them in under a minute. The Burkhart parcel was ours. The final blow came quietly. A letter from the county to the HOA notifying them that all unauthorized structures and fixtures must be removed from the Burkhart parcel unless a lease agreement was filed with the new owner. They tried to negotiate, tried to reason, but the Commons Trust stood firm. If they wanted to continue using any portion of the parcel, they would have to pay a monthly leasing fee and comply with all usage terms. Those terms included a ban on exclusive events, forced member participation, and of course, the removal of all no trespassing and HOA only signs. It was poetic justice. They had tried to control the lake. Now they had to rent back the land they'd stolen from the very people they once bullied. Weeks passed, and the lake community evolved. The hiking trails were now public access. The Commons Trust hosted monthly nature walks and family campouts. The old HOA office, once guarded like a fortress, was repurposed into a shared library and resource center. One afternoon, I walked the southern path with Janice and a few other committee members. Where there had once been exclusion signs and HOA flags, there were now wooden markers hand-carved by local kids. This land belongs to everyone who respects it. You ever think it would go this far? Janice asked me. I smiled. I thought it would go further. She laughed. God, help anyone who messes with you again. I just looked out over the lake, quiet and glassy in the afternoon sun. They had tried to erase me. Now, I was part of the very land they once thought they owned. The lake was quiet again, not in the way it had been when I first arrived, silent, tense, held hostage by invisible rules and power-hungry neighbors, but truly, peacefully quiet. It was the kind of calm that came after a storm had cleared the air, after every secret had been dragged into the light, and every lie buried beneath hard truth. I stood on my dock, just as I had on my very first day. Only now, it wasn't just my dock. It had become a symbol of resistance, of justice, of what can happen when people stop being afraid. The kids in the neighborhood called it the Legacy Dock. I didn't give it that name. They did. And over time, it stuck. 6 months after we acquired the Burkhart parcel and restructured the HOA, Millstone Lake had transformed. The rebranded Millstone Commons Trust now oversaw not just the shared land, but also resident services, things the HOA had once mismanaged for profit. Where Leonard had hoarded power, Janice and the board now shared it freely. Committee meetings were open. Budgets were transparent. People actually volunteered for cleanup weekends. That sense of tension, the one that hung like static in the air whenever a board member passed your yard, gone. But perhaps the biggest change was the attitude. People no longer whispered about what the HOA might do. They laughed about it. They remembered it, yes, but now, like a cautionary tale, a shared myth passed between neighbors to make sure they never let it happen again. And in the center of that myth, me, the dock guy. One afternoon, I got a knock on my door. It was a high school student named Jacob. I'd seen him around before, quiet kid, smart, always sketching something in a notebook. Mr. Callahan, he said, nervous, I'm doing my senior project on community resilience. My teacher said I should talk to you. Community resilience? I chuckled. Sounds like you've come to the right place. I invited him in and we sat on the porch. He asked about everything from the first violation letter to Leonard's arrest to the night we won the land auction. I told him the truth, but not just the facts. I told him how it felt, how infuriating it was to be treated like a trespasser on your own land, how much energy it took to fight something that felt invisible, but also how good it felt to win. Not just for me, for everyone. Before he left, Jacob asked, do you think this would have happened if you hadn't built that dock? I thought about it for a moment. No, I said, but the dock wasn't the reason they came after me. It was the excuse. What scared them was that I didn't flinch. By the end of the school year, Jacob had turned his project into a short documentary called The Lake They Tried to Claim. He interviewed neighbors, showed old footage of town hall meetings, and even used drone shots of the shoreline, including my dock. It won first place in the state competition. But more importantly, it inspired something. Requests started pouring in from other lake communities, rural neighborhoods, even small towns across the state, asking how we did it, how we took back control, how we organized, fought, and ultimately won against an HOA that had once ruled without question. So we put it all together, every document, every process, every legal loophole Leonard had tried to exploit, and created a free digital playbook. We called it the Legacy Binder. A year passed. The dock was still standing, sturdier than ever. The lake had more life than it had in a decade. Local wildlife returned to the South Bank. The nature reserve flourished under stewardship instead of control. Every spring, we hosted a community picnic on the Burkhart parcel. No fences, no reserved seating, no rules that weren't rooted in respect. And every year, someone would tell the story to a new neighbor, a guest, or a relative. See that dock down there? HOA tried to tear it down. Whole mess started over a man who just wanted to fish in peace. People laughed now, but they remembered. And that's what mattered. On the third anniversary of the injunction, the day I received the court order that first shut down the HOA, Shoreline Access, Janice, and a few others showed up with a surprise. They had commissioned a bronze plaque. They didn't tell me until it was installed. I walked out to my dock one morning and saw it, bolted to the rail. The Legacy dock, built with his own hands, defended with truth, stood for everyone. Dedicated to William Callahan, I stood there a long time, staring at it. The sun shimmered across the lake, and a cool breeze rolled in from the north, rippling the surface like silk. It wasn't pride I felt. It was peace. The HOA had come for me with threats and fines and fake rules. They destroyed what I built, and in doing so, they woke something stronger than any board or bylaw. They woke the community. They woke the truth. They woke me. Now, their shoreline was gone. Their board dissolved, and in its place stood the Legacy dock. Not just a platform on the water, but a reminder that when you stand up, really stand up, bullies fall, and communities rise.